How's it going, guys? Welcome to another episode of Stu's Booze Reviews. Today we'll be continuing our 101 series, this time focusing on the wonderful world of whiskey. Now, you're going to notice I do have some notes in my hand, just because there's a lot of stuff to cover, and I want to make sure I'm giving you guys the best and most correct information possible. So, let's go ahead and dive right in. Now, most of what I'm going to be reviewing is going to fall into one of four categories. We have our bourbons, our ryes, our scotches, and our Irishes. Now, there are a few other ones. I do have some Japanese whiskeys that I'll be covering, as well as a couple Canadian whiskeys. But those, by and large, aren't the most popular whiskeys out there right now, so they're not something I'm going to cover in this 101. Now, what makes each of those four different? Let's start with the mash. So what the mash is essentially it's the grains that they're using to make the whiskeys. And there are four main types. You have your corn, which is the primary one for bourbons. You have rye, which tends to be a little bit more of that spicy flavor to it. You have wheat, which usually tends to impart a bit of sweetness to it. And you have malted barley, which tends to be a little bit smokier. So let's start with bourbon. Bourbon has to follow a few rules in order for it to legally be considered bourbon. It must be made in the U.S. It must be made of at least 51% corn. Must be aged in newly charred oak barrels. It must be distilled to normal. Sorry, guys. Allergies. It must be distilled to no more than 160 proof, or 80%, and must be aged at no more than 125 proof, which is around 62.5, and then must be bottled at least 80 proof, 40%. Now, these same rules apply to rye whiskeys, where the only difference being that the mash bill must be at least 51% rye instead of 51% corn. There are also 5 additional terms that usually get used with bourbons, and I have an example of each of these set up in front of us. So the first one we have is small batch. So as you can see on there, small batch is, like it sounds, a small batch. You know, only a few barrels go into this. It depends on the distillery. Obviously, it depends on how many barrels. It could be as few as 5. It could be as many as 10 to 20. It just depends on how they want to do their batching. You have your single barrels. Now, these are just a single barrel. So this came from one barrel and one barrel only. So it's a little bit more, well, actually, it's quite a bit more limited. You have your cask strength or your barrel proof whiskeys. So these are not cut down with anything. This is the proof that it came out of the barrel at. That's what you're getting. You have your straight bourbons. These have been aged for at least 2 years. And if they're younger than 4 years, there's usually an age statement. I believe on this one, yeah. So this one's aged a minimum of 3. And then you also have your bottled in bond. These are aged for at least 4 years and must be bottled at 100 proof. Now there are a few other varieties of your bourbons. So you might see bourbons that have labels such as high rye, wheated, single malt. Those are more just stating that there's a higher percentage of something in it. So like your high ryes have a higher percentage of rye than they do anything else. Now the bourbon is still going to be 51% corn, but you could have a 30% addition of rye to it. Same with wheated. You could have 30% wheat in addition to the 51% corn. Single malt we'll get to a bit later when we cover scotches. That's it for bourbon. Not super complicated, not the most simple. So next up, we're going to talk about Irish whiskeys. Irish whiskeys, obviously, they must be made in Ireland. They have to be distilled to no more than 189.6 proof, 94.8%. I hope nobody drinks it at that, but what do I know? They must be aged in oak for at least 3 years, and they must be bottled at least 80 proof or 40%. That's pretty much it for Irish. Irish isn't all that complicated. You do have a few things like, single pot still, single malt, single grain, very similar things to, your bourbons. Single pot still, they only used, it comes from the same distillery, single pot, single batch basically. Single grain, they only use one major grain, so on and so forth. Now the other big one, Scotch. Scotch is fun. So, must be made in Scotland, of course. Again, distilled to no more than 189.6 proof, 94.8%. Scotch must contain no added substances other than water or coloring. So, you can't add any adjuncts, basically. Honestly, it'd be better if they didn't add coloring either, but that's neither here nor there. Again, must be aged for at least 3 years and must be bottled at 80 proof or higher. Now, Scotch does have a few different varieties, but there's a majority of them that are either single malt, which has been distilled at a single distillery using pot still distillation and made from malted barley, or blended, which is a blend of whiskeys. So let's talk about malting. Now that we're getting to Scotch, we're getting to malted barley. What is malted barley? So malting is a style of drying where the grains, mostly barley, but there are some other malted grains that are used, malted wheat, for one example. But basically, they soak these grains in water until it begins to germinate. So that seed begins to crack open and start growing, and then it's dried. This allows usually for the better modifying of starches, which are located in those grains, into the sugars, which feed fermentation. So by doing malted barleys, you're going to get a little bit more sugar out of each of those grains. And we'll talk a little bit more about that very shortly. Scotch can then be further divided into 5 subsections, which are based on their location in Scotland. The 5 main regions are the Lowlands, the Highlands, which include the islands. Highlands Island, there's a rhyme in there somewhere. Speyside, which is my personal favorite, the island of Islay, and Campbelltown. Now, your lowland Scotches are from the southern half of Scotland, and they usually tend to be kind of lighter, sweeter, a little bit more floral. I think of them, well, I can't say I can think of them. They aren't very popular in the States, so I haven't really had a lot of chance to try them. I think I've tried 1 or 2, but it's been a while. Highland Scotches, which are probably the most prevalent type of Scotch, they are from the northern half of Scotland. They tend to be sweet, spicy, and malty. They are my least favorite of the 3. It is what it is. I'm not a big fan of that spicy, malty flavor. Now, Campbelltown only has 3 distilleries, so I'm not sure how available they are in the States. I haven't heard of any of the 3 that I looked up, so take this with a little bit of a grain of salt. The characteristics of those, from what I've looked up, tend to be peaty, sweet, and smoky. Now, Speyside Scotches are from distilleries that are located alongside the River Spey. It's kind of, and you should see when I showed the graphic, it's kind of in that middle part between the Highlands and the Lowlands. I love Speysides. They tend to be rich, textured, and can be floral and fruity. Really, really, really easy sippers. And finally, we come to Islay Scotches. These are all produced in the island of Islay. They tend to be either medium-bodied and saturated with peat smoke, brine, and iodine if it's from the south part of the island, or if it's from the north part, it tends to be lighter flavored, a little bit more mossy flavored, with some seaweed and a little bit nutty. Now, what gives Islay those characteristic flavors comes from how they dry the barley. We talked about that before, how when you're doing malted barley, you dry it to stop it from germinating. Well, on the island of Islay, they don't have wood. They have peat. So when you burn peat, it gets very, very, very smoky. That's where a lot of that smoky flavor comes from, is because when you're drying your barley over an open fire, you're getting all that peat smoke just being absorbed by it. And honestly, we're done. That's it. We've covered whiskey for the most part. If there are a few outliers, like I said before, we have like our Japanese whiskeys, we have some Canadian whiskeys. When I do those reviews, I will absolutely talk about it. But yeah, thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed this lesson, or you just want to see me drink and rate more stuff, hit that follow button. In our the next episode, I believe we're going to be doing a Japanese whiskey. Thanks, guys. Cheers.